On April 9th, 1865, the Civil War as we know it ended. Ulysses Grant, Union General, and Robert E. Lee, Confederate General, met at Appomattox, shook hands, and the war was over. And the 11 seceded states came right back into the Union, and everyone lived happily ever after, right? No, of course not. Of course not. So we're going to start today by talking about the challenges that the nation faced at the end of the Civil War. None bigger than having 11 states of the so-called United States who had left the Union. They wanted to come back. Lincoln was like, okay, sure, we can try to make something work, because you've got to remember, Lincoln never acknowledged the Confederacy as a new country. So for all he knew, they were always the United States and nothing needed to happen. But perhaps the bigger question, you've now got all these free African Americans. They were once enslaved, and now you've got to integrate them into the social society. Before we continue, it would be a huge assist if you could subscribe to the channel, as it is the very best way to support the hard work I do to produce these videos, and let's get right back into it. That social integration of African Americans, and that's the word I can't really stress enough. Social integration. And then you've got to look at, okay, the entire nation, mostly the South, but the entire nation, the economy was a mess. They had fought each other. The economy was a mess. Structures, buildings, and towns as people knew it, they were a mess. You had to rebuild it. So there's the Reconstruction. There's the figurative way to think of it, which is rebuilding the Union, getting the states back together. But you also have to take it literally to some degree. Buildings were destroyed. Fields were destroyed. What are you going to do? You've got to rebuild it. You've got to reconstruct it. And then rights. Lincoln, very pro 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment. Johnson did, on many accounts, everything in his power to stop those amendments from passing. So there, as we get into Lincoln's vision, popularized by the Gettysburg Address, he was pro-rights. He wanted African Americans to be integrated into society as easily as possible, get civil rights, as eventually Civil Rights Act of 1866. But it is worth noting that as historians, I will be clear about this, I am not a historian. I am a student of history, and I love history, but I'm not nearly as knowledgeable as many historians are, so I will be transparent about that. But even for them, there is a limit to knowledge. There is. As he was assassinated just a few days after the end of the Civil War, there is a limit to knowledge of what his policies were. There's absolutely a limit to knowledge of how the policies would have played out. Because, of course, Lincoln dies. He goes to Ford's Theater. John Wilkes Booth goes up behind him, and then all of a sudden, Andrew Johnson is the President of the United States. Not all of a sudden, but because it took a long time to get the information around the country back then, and the conspiracies and complexities of the Lincoln assassination are beyond the scope of this video. I could make a whole video in and of itself of everything that happened on that night and into the next morning, and the manhunt for John Wilkes Booth. We're not going to go into that as much right now. What I would like to focus on, though, is they lost a leader. The man who dragged the nation through the Civil War, won the Civil War for the Union, is gone. I'll repeat that again just so it really sinks in. The man who led the country through the Civil War and led to a Union victory. Of course, there were others, but the main guy behind it, Lincoln, is gone. We're just never going to see him again. In a lot of ways, you've got to liken it to George Washington. Obviously, he didn't die in office, but this man who won us the war against Britain, he's leaving. He's gone, and there's now a new leader, and Washington is going to retire. And the way that's similar to Lincoln is Lincoln's not going to lead us anymore. Someone else has got to. And that becomes Johnson. He was the only Southern senator to remain loyal to the Union during the Civil War, and that is why Lincoln chose him as the VP. In 1860, the vice president was Hannibal Hamlin of Maine, and he was the right guy at the time. You've got Lincoln of Kentucky, Illinois, and then Johnson of Maine really trying to win in the North, which is exactly how it happened. But come 1864, he needed to balance out the ticket, so he chose the Southern senator from Tennessee. Of course, nobody expected him to actually become president, right? Vice president is a historically insignificant position. That's why Lincoln wanted him to be the VP. On Inauguration Day 1865, Hannibal Hamlin of Maine sat in absolute disbelief that he lost his job. He lost his job. And Johnson gave a historically awful speech. He was drunk. 6 weeks later, he became President of the United States of America. And where we are here with the comparisons between Lincoln and Johnson, where you've got to start with Johnson is his ego. His ego. Lincoln was trying to get the states back into the Union, and Johnson said, okay, we can maybe try to figure something out, get you back into the Union, come to the White House, we can talk about it. And, southern states wanted to come back into the Union, so they went to the White House. Johnson, can we come back into the Union? Get on your knees and beg to me. That's pretty much what he said. And so they did, and it's apparently like we're all fine now. They're back into the Union. Obviously, we're not all fine and dandy now, right? Even if they are states and even if they have gotten their statehood back, the social reintegration. Are unionists, Union civilians, willing to accept these states coming back? Are Confederate citizens willing to accept coming back to the United States of America? Social acceptance, social integration. Johnson was against civil rights. That's not an overstatement to say at all. Civil Rights Act of 1866 passes in the House, passes in the Senate, goes to the president's desk, veto. He hits it with a veto. And so the path of how a bill becomes a law goes back to Congress. You need, I think it's a 2/3 majority in both houses to override the veto, and they get it. The Civil Rights Act of 1866 passes despite Johnson's veto. Johnson had a lot of clashes with Congress. He did. Lincoln got along better with Congress. Johnson had a huge clash with Congress. He was impeached by the House, and he was acquitted by the Senate. I think it's a 2/3 majority to remove a president from office in the Senate, and Johnson survived by just one vote. He survived by one vote. He kept his job intact. But again, it's hard to think about now. If Lincoln had lived out his second term, how would things be different? The next 100 years, or even the next 15 years of Reconstruction. Reconstruction was brutal. I mean, you had the rise of the first Ku Klux Klan. You had good things like the 13th, 14th, 15th Amendment, but rise of the first KKK, it's a hypothetical, so you can't really analyze it too much. But had Lincoln lived out his term, maybe that doesn't happen. Because Johnson was so vehemently against the social integration of African Americans and so vehemently against civil rights for African Americans that he made life as difficult as humanly possible. Lincoln had a completely different philosophy, and the only reason he gave Johnson the VP job was so that he could keep his presidential job. Nobody thought he would ever become president, and nobody thought he would be able to do that much damage to African Americans. And I made a video about Andrew Johnson and about all the presidents, but we'll centralize Andrew Johnson here for you so you can take a look at that to get more of a detailed view on his legacy. Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. As always, I do appreciate you watching, and I will see you next week.